We met at a local community centre after we were done with our meeting, and he told me he had the goods. I reached into my pocket, grabbed the $20 I had waiting, and I slipped it to him. He pulled the creation out of his bag and he handed it over reverentially. It really works, he said. You just have to make sure you turn all the lights out. Was it drugs? Nope. A stolen laptop? Nope. What my friend had acquired for me was the product of over 10 years of plant biotechnology and probably over a century of imagination. A glowing plant. From the fabled baromets of the 18th century, part lamb, part plant, through the triffids of the 1920s, and the 1980s plant-based Godzilla monster Biolante, plants with unnatural powers have never failed to fascinate the imagination. And here, I had a plant that could do what no plant before has ever done, produce its own visible light. Welcome to Modified. I'm your host, Dr. Orlando DeLange, ex-plant scientist and current science teacher. This podcast is my attempt to guide you through the science of GMOs and hopefully just enough of the history and the social context to give you a path forward in your own thinking. And if all else fails, I hope you'll enjoy some of the surprising stories and fascinating facts in the world of genetically modified plants. This is episode 15, The Colourful World of GMOs. I decided to go with that episode title after realizing that when I laid out almost all the GMOs that I wanted to talk about in this episode, most of them had a colour theme. But really, this episode is a whistle-stop tour of some GMO plants that are currently grown and sold, but are not nearly as well-known or high impact as the Bt and herbicide-tolerant crops covered in the previous few episodes. So yeah, in this episode, I'm going to take you on a little tour of some of the lesser-known commercially available GMOs. None of the products in this episode have had anywhere near the distribution and impact as Bt crops and herbicide-tolerant crops, but I want to give you a sense of some of the possibilities that genetic engineering has afforded and how that has been put to use to either solve problems or to just earn a buck or two. I will stick to crops in the sense of plants that are grown at scale and harvested for human purposes, but several of the examples are not crops that you eat. I'm just sticking to actually available products currently, or ones that maybe have historically been available in the near past, but not going back decades. The crops in this episode are not just ideas, and I want to emphasize that, because if you Google something like top 10 crazy GMOs, most of the things you'll find are more proof of concepts that were maybe made once in a lab, but were never actually developed and distributed as products. So I'm just going to skip those, and these are all things that you can, I think in all cases, well, maybe one exception, these are things that if you're in the US, you could currently buy. Unlike most other episodes, this one is not fully scripted, it's kind of partially scripted, and you'll see at some points I might digress a little bit. But yeah, let's dive in. I want to start with glowing plants. I mentioned this in the cold open. And I do plan in future to do a bit of a deep dive into the world of synthetic biology, which is and was, and to some extent still is, a movement within biotechnology that basically aimed to bioengineer our way to a utopian future. And glowing plants were a surprisingly big part of that vision. They were first promised to the world by a Kickstarter from a couple of biotechnologists based in the Bay Area back in 2013, and almost right away that Kickstarter was fully funded. And yet 13 years later, that glowing plant has never seen the light of day. And I emphasize that glowing plant because we do have one, because a few years ago, Idaho-based startup Light.bio actually went ahead and did what the glowing plant folks were promising. And specifically what they did was create a bioluminescent petunia, trademarked as the firefly petunia, if you want to look for it, using an approach that they have patented. And if you live in the US, you can get your own firefly petunia for about $25. In this case, what you'll get is a reasonably mature plant with flowers on it in a kind of styrofoam box. It may be a little bit worse for wear when you get it, but give it some water, it'll be fine. And this firefly petunia, it uses a luciferase from a fungus called, now let me see if I can get this name right, Neonothopanus, let's go with that, gardneri, from Brazil. It's a mushroom. It looks a bit like a chanterelle or an oyster mushroom. And so I said luciferase, glowing plants, what are we really talking about here? What is bioluminescence? So bioluminescence is the production of light by a living organism. So there's lots of other ways that living organisms can seem to have kind of color or light-based properties that are all about some variation of taking in light from the environment and modifying it in some way, absorbing light, refracting light, reflecting light. There's a property called fluorescence where the kind of color of the light is changed and then re-emitted. In this case, it's genuinely like new photons of light being produced from inside the organism and then emitted outwards. And this is rare, but not that rare. There are plenty of organisms that do this, particularly animals and some fungi do this. And it's not something that plants do naturally. But now, for the first time ever, to my knowledge in all of evolutionary history, we have a plant that can produce light, and it does that with the help of a specific enzyme. And these enzymes, we always call them luciferase. That's like a generic word for an enzyme that is able to catalyze this process of basically taking chemicals and kind of processing them in a way that they release energy in the form of light. So there's many luciferases. They are evolutionarily kind of independent from each other. So this one from mushrooms is very different to the one that you would find in fireflies, which is probably, when you think bioluminescent organism, fireflies or glowworms, depending on what you call them, might be what you think of. So that's what bioluminescence is. What they've done is basically borrow genes from this mushroom, put it into the plant, and that allows it to produce visible light. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work very well. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I got this plant. I was kind of excited about it because it's something that like I mentioned, this had been a long time coming as an idea. And so I was pretty psyched to get a glowing plant. And I wasn't expecting it to be kind of sensational and to light up the room, but I was expecting to be able to see it in a dark room. But even with like really turning out all the lights and drawing curtains, it's very hard to see. You kind of have to put it in a totally sealed chamber, and then you'll particularly see it in the flowers and the petals. And partly that's because if you think about a plant, they are basically light-absorbing machines. They have all these rich green leaves and green stems, and that green is chlorophyll, which is a pigment that absorbs light, and that chlorophyll is generally accompanied by a bunch of other light-absorbing pigments that absorb light at other wavelengths that the chlorophyll isn't particularly good at absorbing. So, like plants are good at harvesting light and trapping it. So if you're producing light inside the plant, it has to fight to kind of get out of there. And to kind of escape the plant and for you to be able to see it. And this process of bioluminescence, like I kind of mentioned briefly, it uses chemical energy. It kind of uses the energy that the plant has locked up in various molecules inside its cells. And so it's kind of, it saps energy from the plant. And that, I think, has been one of the problems in developing these plants, is you've got to try and strike the balance between producing enough light that it's visible and not kind of forcing the plant to produce so much light that it actually stops the plant from being able to grow. And I do get the sense these petunias look a little odd, but they're like not terrible, and they're able to grow. The flowers look nice, but I think they're a little bit stunted compared to non-GMO petunias, because it's just you're asking a lot of this plant to make it do something that is very much not evolved for. And I do find it funny because back in the 2010s, when I kind of mentioned there was this field of synthetic biology, and part of the kind of vision of synthetic biology was glowing plants. It was kind of doing everything using genetically engineered organisms that we might currently do with machines, with hardware and silica-based products. And so there was this idea that we could use glowing trees in place of street lamps. And it's just seeing how little light this glowing petunia produces. The idea that you could use glowing trees in place of street lamps is not come. Don't hold your breath. Basically, I don't think that's going to happen. But if you love a cute gimmick of a product, and sometimes I do, then go get yourself a glowing petunia by all means. Okay, let's move on to blue roses. So go out in nature, go look at flowers, and you will see many, many colors of flowers, and it will seem like every color is represented in flowers, but that's not true. You tend to see that flowers from related plants have similar colors, and you'll kind of have like color families that match plant families, where, for example, there's a family of plants that are the rose family that includes roses, but also apple trees and cherry trees. And they all tend to have flowers that are kind of in the white to pink to red spectrum. And you'll see other flowers, I don't know, things like daffodils and like that, where you have lots of yellows. You will see occasional greens. And you do see blue flowers in nature, but it's one of the rarer colors. And, many families of plants basically lack the enzymes that they need to be able to produce the blue pigment, which is normally a kind of set of related chemicals that we call delphinidins. And that is true of roses. So there are no natural blue roses. And by natural, I know this, I might get some quibble with this, I'm including all kinds of GMO-based plant breeding. So roses, as you probably experience them day to day, are very much not natural. There are many wild rose species, and you can kind of go out into forests and you'll see rose-like flowers, and those are the kind of relatives and ancestors of the roses that you might buy from a store. But yeah, the roses that you buy from a store that you might plant in your garden as ornamentals are a product of many centuries of selective breeding, and it's very much ongoing. There's a very passionate community that includes like big companies, but also small, individual hobbyists who breed new roses by basically using sexual reproduction to hybridize different rose varieties to get, and one of the many traits about roses that people are very interested in is color. So, for example, I'm lucky, live fairly close to Portland, Oregon, which has a rose test garden where roses from around the world, like new varieties that have been made, will be planted there to kind of test their overall properties because it has good rose growing conditions. And so you can go see just an incredible variety of roses. And there are kind of rose gardens like that in many places in the world where they'll deliberately grow many different varieties next to each other. And it may seem like the possibilities are endless, but what you'll never find in those rose beds is a blue rose. It's something that people have tried to achieve, but they tend to basically, the way that people have tried to achieve a blue rose with non-GMO approaches is by just reducing all of the pink and red out of the flowers. And it really just gives them kind of a dusty gray, slightly lilac hue. It's not what you'd call blue. So this is a gap in the market. And so a Japanese company called Suntory, which if you're a big fan of maybe Japanese whiskey, then you might know Suntory. They're a big brand, and they are mostly known for drinks of various kinds. So this did seem like quite a strange project for them to take on in, I believe, the early 2000s. Or back, I guess, starting in the 90s, because they released the product all the way back in 2002. And, I'm not sure where you can get hold of it outside of Japan. It does seem like it is still distributed in Japan. And I think there are some specialist providers in the US who can get it for you. It's not something that's going to be easy to find at like a store. But yeah, they made these blue roses by basically borrowing some genes from plants that are able to produce blue. By basically, it's genes encoding the enzymes that allow the plant to produce delphinidins, these blue pigments. And so yeah, you have this naturally blue rose, and that was very exciting. I mean, Suntory made a lot out of it, but unfortunately, I feel like go Google it. It's called Applause is like the brand name basically of this product, and you will be a little bit disappointed, I think. I'm not sure if you'd be more or less disappointed than the glowing plant, because it is not blue. I don't think it's blue. Most people, when they look at it, don't think it's blue. I mean, everyone sees colors, a little bit differently, what you may or may not call blue. I think most people will call it mauve or mauve, depending on how you pronounce it, but kind of a bluish purple is about the best you could say for it. It's definitely not, I mean, if you think of really blue flowers like irises, what else is a really blue flower? Bluebells. It's not that kind of blue. It definitely has a strong purple color because you're kind of fighting against a lot of red pigments that the rose is also producing. And they did try. So basically what they did was they took one gene from a pansy, which is basically encodes a gene that encodes an enzyme to produce delphinidins. They also used RNA interference to reduce the expression of a gene inside the rose that is basically allows accumulation of red pigments. So they were trying to kind of reduce the red and just have blue, but, it only worked so well. Maybe if they, kept iterating on this, they would have got that really blue rose, but like I mentioned, Suntory are not mostly an ornamental plant producer, so I don't think they were that bothered. I'll link all of these things in the show notes so you can go and see it for yourself if you don't want to look around for it, but it's actually very easy if you just Google blue rose, Suntory, or applause. Yeah, kind of a fun gimmick. I would lump it together with the glowing plant in that regard. And kind of, I think, another one that's in what I would call the fun gimmick category is the pink glow pineapple. Have you ever had a pink pineapple? If so, it was probably this rosé pineapple. Rosé was kind of the patented name, and it's sold under the trademark of Pink Glow. So, and pretty much if you've eaten a commercial pineapple that had really bright pink flesh, it was probably this pineapple, because it's not something that naturally occurs, at least in any commercially available pineapple varieties. And maybe if you haven't had one, and you're like, wow, pink pineapple, that sounds amazing, well, you can go to their website, which again I will link in the show notes, and you can order one in a beautiful gift box for only $49. Maybe that seems a bit much for a pineapple. Maybe when you see how nice the gift box is, and how cool the pink fruit is, you'll change your mind. I don't know. I did not go for one, but I would definitely, if I saw one around, I'd give it a go. And apparently they do have a kind of slightly different flavor profile to a normal pineapple that's a little bit sweeter. So, people seem to like them. I don't know. Anyway, it took me a little bit of digging to work out what was actually going on kind of under the hood of the pink pineapple, because this isn't something that the company who made and sell them, which is Del Monte, were disclosing. But, they did disclose it because they patented these pineapples, and when you patent something, you do have to give a pretty readable written description of what exactly it is and how you made it. So I found the patent and had a little look through that, and here's what I worked out. So it's basically 2 transgenes, and in what will by now seem like quite a familiar sort of approach. So one is a gene from another plant that encodes an enzyme involved in pigment accumulation. So that's kind of very similar to with the blue rose, where they took a gene from pansy that made this enzyme for blue pigment. In this case, they took a gene from tangerine, and the gene is called phytoene synthase, or the protein that gene encodes, and it promotes the accumulation of the red pigment lycopene. So this is kind of a different situation here, whereas in the rose they're trying to reduce the red, here they're trying to amp up the production of the red pigment. And then there were 2 more genes that they inserted, which are just inverted versions of naturally occurring pineapple genes. And these genes encode, they're inverted versions of the genes that encode lycopene cyclases, which take linear lycopene molecules, which are red, and then they, you might guess from the word cyclase, basically turn it into a ring form version. And these are kind of ring form versions of lycopene are orange and yellow. So it's basically ensuring that red pigment stays red and doesn't get turned into an orange or yellow form, which is basically what the pineapple naturally does. You don't get much lycopene accumulating in the pineapple because any that is there will be converted into an orange or yellow pigment instead. And this process of using inverted copies to silence the expression of the existing gene inside the genome is called RNA interference, which was covered in some earlier episodes. So you might remember it as the same mechanism used in the first ever GMO crop, which was the Flavor Saver tomato. And it is interesting. It's been used a lot in what we might call these first generation GMO crops, which are GMO crops produced from the 90s, basically up until the present day, where you just take a gene and you kind of shoot it into the plant genome and hope that it has some strong effect. And if you're wondering, why first generation, what's second generation? Well, wait till next episode and you'll hear more on that. But yeah, RNA interference is a really great kind of trait because all you need to know is the sequence of the gene that's already in the plant. And then you just take that and you kind of invert the sequence. It's very easy to do at a computer. And then now you've got the sequence of the gene you want to insert, and you can kind of order that to be synthesized from a company or to do it in-house if you're a big company with a lot of lab facilities. It's not... these days it's very easy to do. If back in the 90s when a lot of these products were being originally developed, it was not super easy but not that hard to do to kind of synthesize that stretch of DNA that encodes that gene and then shoot it into the plant genome via, if you remember, there's basically biolistics, which is a gene gun, literally shooting it into the cells, or using agrobacterium, which is like a bacterium that has been co-opted for its ability to insert genes into plant genomes. But yeah, so you can use this RNA interference approach to very easily like shut down expression of genes inside the plant, specific genes in a targeted way, and that can be quite useful. Anyway, so that's the pink glow pineapple. It's available in the US and Canada since 2020. I haven't tried it, like I said, but it gets good reviews. Yeah, so that's the last, and shall we say, the frivolous or gimmicky GMOs on our list. The next are at least attempting to solve problems other than being a cool color. And so the next one, it is color-based, but the color is not exactly the point. They are purple tomatoes. Kind of bridges the world of gimmicky color traits into more, I don't know, serious applications. So, this is one I could talk for a long time about because I actually know a fair amount about this product and have a personal connection. Because back when I was a PhD student I can't remember if it was 2012 or 2013, I went to multiple scientific presentations from the inventor of this product, Dr. Kathy Martin, and she's still based in the John Innes Centre in the UK. That centre is in Norfolk, which is a part of the UK. And you may remember the John Innes Centre because its first director was one of the founders of genetics, William Bateson. It opened in 1910 and it is still very much a global centre for applied plant genetics. And the company that Dr. Martin span out for her product is named for the location of the centre, the John Innes Centre. So the company is called Norfolk Healthy Produce. Yet despite the name, it is not actually based in Norfolk, it's based in Davis, California, which you may also remember has a very deep connection to plant genetic engineering, and UC Davis, the university in Davis, California, is also one of the global centers for applied plant genetics. So the location makes sense, and in general, being based in the US makes sense, because I believe I'm right in saying that they tried and failed to get approval to sell the product in the UK. It is currently available in the US, and apparently very recently got approval for sale in Australia. So, what is this product that I'm talking about? Well, the product is a purple tomato. There are many tomatoes bred using non-GMO techniques that have purple skins. But these plants have purple stems, the purple tomatoes, and very purple fruits all the way through, not just in the skin. So those non-GMO ones mostly just have a purple skin. The variety they introduced this trait into is a cherry tomato variety. So if you think that's those tomatoes that grow as like small clusters, big clusters of small juicy fruits. Small, juicy, very purple tomato fruits. And they're purple because they're rich in a type of pigment. We're getting very familiar with pigments. And this is another one. This isn't delphinidins. It isn't carotenoids or lycopene. It's anthocyanins. So we're getting very familiar. Remember, delphinidins are blue, carotenoids are yellow to red, anthocyanins are purple. And plants also, of course, have the family of chlorophylls, which are those green pigments that are the primary pigment used in light harvesting. Anyway, tomatoes naturally produce anthocyanins, but mostly in tomato skins and not at very high levels. So tomato skins will have some amount of anthocyanins, but not that much. The main thing they'll have in there is a lot of lycopene, making them very red. But what Dr. Martin did was to build on her lab study of proteins known as transcription factors. These are proteins that regulate which genes are turned on or off in any given cell in any given condition. Transcription factors, I think of them as like the operating system of the cell. They can take in information and convert that into the language of gene expression to produce results. And often, particularly in these complex, what we call eukaryotic organisms, that's ourselves, that's plants, that's fungi, and many other organisms of kind of large complex cells, there is really a whole layer of information processing that goes into the transcription factors, where you'll have many different inputs having kind of coming together through cascades of multiple layers of transcription factors until they arrive at what we'll call the master transcription factor, which then kind of makes the decision, makes the kind of on-off switch about what program are we running in the cell today. And that will often mean turning on and off not just one gene, but a whole set of different genes that together give you a kind of coordinated response. So in this case, what she had worked on was the transcription factors from snapdragon plants. And snapdragons produce many different colors of flowers. They're very pretty, very common, like ornamental flowers. And they are able to produce very anthocyanin-rich flowers under certain conditions. And she looked at the transcription factor, the master transcription factor, which is responsible for kind of turning on the production of anthocyanins. And she took that and put it into, well, she and her team, remember everything in biology is done in teams, put that into the tomato plant. And indeed, this did lead to massive accumulation of anthocyanins in flowers and stems and the fruit itself. And this is cool because anthocyanins, as well as being like pretty purple pigments, are antioxidants. So what does that mean? Antioxidants is a catch-all for a wide range of chemicals that are able to soak up molecules that have wild, unruly electrons attached to them, which are like loose cannons able to react with and damage cell components. And those components include DNA and the proteins that monitor and repair DNA damage. And when DNA gets damaged, occasionally that damage is in the genes that keep cell division in check. And when those genes get damaged, the genes that keep cell division in check, then cells start to divide uncontrollably. And that is what we call cancer. So, to put it very simplistically, antioxidants are cancer fighting. And indeed, some experiments in mice done by the Martin lab showed that basically when you take mice that have been bred to be genetically predisposed to cancer and then feed them this diet based on these purple tomatoes and compare that to a control, the mice fed the purple tomatoes had much longer lifespans. They all died in the end because they all succumbed to the cancers that they've been bred to produce, but the ones fed the purple tomatoes lived longer. Why are there mice that have been deliberately bred to get cancer and die? Well, that is a dark side of science that as a vegetarian I find quite frankly disturbing, but let's stay on the tomatoes. Anyway, to my knowledge, no clinical trials in humans have been done to show that these purple tomatoes provide any cancer-fighting benefit, but the same is true for all sorts of dietary supplements that people buy in bulk at great expense because of vague promises of health benefits. So I don't think the purple tomatoes are really out of step with the industry in that regard. But just like those hawking multivitamins, Norfolk Healthy Produce is really leaning into the vague health benefits, even if they can't really show you any clinical trials that prove a health benefit in humans. I mean, just look, the name of the company is Norfolk Healthy Produce. The health benefit is very much at the center of their marketing. The pink pineapples, for example, do not claim to provide any sort of health benefit. And you look at the pink pineapple website, they're really going for it's fun vibe, and that's about it. Anyway, I'm being a little bit mean to the purple tomato people, but I want to be more complimentary now. I think that the purple tomatoes, a little bit like the glowing plants, are an example of GMOs that are definitely not a product of big ag tech. And I actually think that was one of the motivations of those involved in producing it, that basically show that GMOs are not just Monsanto and kind of mean-spirited litigation and crazy profits at the expense of small farmers and consumers. That they can be about small teams of scientists trying to do some good in the world. Personally, I find that a little bit naive because it's basically you're kind of helping to greenwash the reputation of the dominant practices in the GMO industry. But I do think like they were really trying to maybe showcase a different and better way of doing things, and I can see that. And it is really a small team effort. Norfolk Healthy Produce, is a small company. And yes, they are trying to make money. It is a private company, but they do seem to be quite mission-driven. In the next season, when we look more at the business of GMOs, you'll see that big ag tech companies are definitely not the only players in the GMO business and never have been. There are smaller companies like Norfolk Healthy Produce, and there are many government labs and agricultural development agencies within governments which play a really major role. So what if you want a purple tomato? Well, you can't go and buy one from a store right now, I'm pretty sure, but what you can buy is seeds for their online store. They're not too crazy. They're $15 for a packet. I'm not sure exactly how many seeds you get, but the idea is this is for home gardeners, or if you have a little window box, They're fairly easy to grow. I haven't grown them myself. I don't have in a window box. I've got nowhere to grow these things. But I would be kind of intrigued. And I'll put the link in the show notes, or you can just Google Norfolk Healthy Produce and you'll find it. What you already might be thinking is, seeds? Is this the same thing as Monsanto, where I'll be prosecuted for saving seeds? Well, apparently not. But you cannot sell the fruits. So there's a very different prospect to, say, a farmer buying crop seeds. And here's the exact text of the terms you agree to when you purchase the seeds. 1, the seeds are a patented variety and are sold to enjoy in your home garden and with your local community. And then 2, no sales of fruit, seeds, or plants are permitted in this agreement, including any derived varieties. So you're perfectly welcome to keep the seeds and even share them locally, but you're not allowed to sell them. So yeah, these are for the home gardener to enjoy and share, not to sell. The tomatoes were actually developed all the way back in the 2010s, and were kind of ready to go. And at first, they wanted to commercialize via tomato juice products made and sold at scale, but for whatever reason, that did not succeed. That was only after they spent years trying to get approval in the US, UK, and Canada to pursue that product idea. Then, when they pivoted to selling seeds, they had to go through approval processes all over again, only getting the go-ahead in the US in 2024. So these seeds have only been on sale in the US for a couple of years. And that's a similar story to so many of these GMO products. What we're saying in the last few years, or what we're seeing in the last few years, is products coming to market that may have been 20 or in some cases even 30 years in the making. These are still what we would call first-generation GMO plants, to use that term again, using that simple approach of just randomly inserting, and by random I mean the position that the genes land in the genome, so randomly inserting some genes into a target genome. In our next episode, we'll look at the promising new approach of gene editing. But anyway, I've already been prattling on for about 30 minutes, and we have 3 more GMOs to get through in this episode. The final colourful GMO that I want to cover in this episode is the rainbow papaya, and it's colourful only in name. I'm just going to give it a quick mention because I plan on doing a whole deep dive episode on it next season. The rainbow papaya is a crop, and it is grown at scale, though not nearly the same scale as, let's say, BT soybean. But it is most of the papaya crop that is grown and sold in the state of Hawaii, and that's about 5,000 tons per year. It's a crop that was developed by the team of Dr. Dennis Gonzalez, who working within the US Department of Agriculture, who not only oversee and support agriculture, but they have their own agricultural research labs. Dr. Gonzalez himself is from Hawaii, and so even though the research was done at a lab on the mainland at Cornell, this is a different kind of GMO story, really, than what you might be used to thinking about. So this is a researcher from Hawaii seeing a local problem and developing a solution to solve that local problem. And the problem was the papaya ring spot virus, which was really devastating the Hawaii papaya industry back in the 90s and was very much an existential threat. And so the solution, despite the name, is nothing to do with actual visible color. The rainbow papaya has virus genes in it, or more specifically, inverted copies that trigger that process of RNA interference. In this case, the RNA interference destroys viral genes if the plant is infected. And it's actually a very effective defense approach. It's a little like a vaccine, but built into the genome of the papaya plant. So just to briefly summarize, I'd say it's been a big success. Like I said, it's most of the papaya that's now planted in Hawaii. And in that sense, it's a success. It continues to be widely grown, sold, and eaten. I tucked into some rainbow papaya about a year back. Very delicious. I mean, just tastes like papaya. It has not been without its controversies and detractors, but we'll get into those next season. So let's move on to do another quick one, because it's yet another one that I do think I'm going to do another whole deep dive episode on next season, because there's some interesting things to pick at here. It is another fruit, another GMO fruit crop with a trait based on RNA interference. It is the Arctic apple. These apples are, I am told, widely sold in the US. I think commonly found in school lunches. Despite that, I have not encountered them myself, but I might just not be looking hard enough. You're not going to find them in the kind of bins of apples in a grocery store. They'll be with cut fruits, probably in a refrigerated compartment, because the whole point, as you'll see, is to be used in preparation of pre-sliced apples. So the trait is based on an inverted copy of the natural apple gene, polyphenol oxidase, a gene that encodes an enzyme that triggers the oxidation of certain compounds in plant cells that then combine together, or what we call polymerize, to form large complex molecules that have a brown color, and the word for those molecules is melanins. The process is called browning, and it's common in plants, particularly in fruits. Also, I think just kind of independently, that exact same process happens in insects and crustaceans in response to wounding. In both plants and in insects and crustaceans, it's something that happens in response to wounding. And it is an active process that requires these enzymes. It's not just kind of what happens if air gets in contact with fruit tissue. It requires something actively happening inside the cell to produce these melanins. Fruit browning is one of those biological phenomena that is very studied in terms of the how, but barely at all in terms of the why. I did a bit of digging into this, and the dominant thing that you'll find stated, based on not a ton of direct research, is that it provides an antimicrobial defense. Basically, if a fruit is physically damaged, that physical damage creates an entry point where, fruits tend to have very thick skins for a reason, to stop microbes getting into them and basically eating the fruit and the seeds before they've had a time to disperse and germinate. The fruit is a vehicle for the seed. You don't want microbes to eat and destroy that seed before it's been able to do its job and carry on the next generation. So the browning is to kind of limit the damage that came from maybe the fruit gets physically damaged by a bird pecking at it, or maybe it's fallen to the floor and got a bit damaged. There's all sorts of ways fruits get damaged. And of course, fruits get damaged in the process of being harvested, but they definitely get damaged in the process of slicing them into pieces to sell. So that's why this is particularly developed as a product for the production of apple slices, which are really kind of their own product category. Anyway, like I said, this is what they were trying to do, was reduce this browning. They did that using RNA interference by inserting an inverted copy of a gene that encodes the enzyme PPO, that was the polyphenol oxidase. And that reduces the expression of that enzyme. And indeed, so these apples, when you slice them into pieces, those slices stay longer, and we can say they stay fresher for longer. And what that means is they don't develop that browning, and the browning is not just a color issue. It does change the texture and flavor profile, and most people don't really like to eat the apple slice if it's browned. So it's kind of makes them. There's nothing wrong about eating the browned apple slice. It's not inherently unhealthy. It's just most people won't want to, and so these apple slices remain in a state that is more kind of appealing and consumable for longer. Let me find, where did I write how much longer they last? I think it was about a week longer these will last than traditional apples. And basically what that amounts to is less food waste, especially if you think about a school that buys big bulk packets of apple slices to distribute in school lunches. And maybe very often they might just it's hard to perfectly time exactly how many you're going to need over a week. And you'll often find that a lot of them will go bad because they want to make sure they don't run out, so they'll order a few more. And by ordering the Arctic apple slices, they can overall reduce waste, which helps the school keep costs down, and so you can see the appeal there. It's not like the apple slice itself is going to taste any better or really any different to the non-GMO apple slice. And what the Arctic apple like to promote is that they're doing that without the need for adding any chemical preservatives, which is true. And if you're thinking what do the apples taste like? It depends. They've actually produced, the Arctic apple is kind of a generic name for this trait, but they've achieved this in multiple different apple genotypes, what we call cultivars or varieties. And the two that they seem to be selling the most is the Golden Delicious version and the Granny Smith version. I would be excited if they came out with a variety based in the background of the Cosmic Crisp variety, which is indeed what I am thinking to maybe dive into in Season 2, is to look into the development of the Arctic apple and the Cosmic Crisp apple, which were both developed in Washington State at about the same time. One is a GMO, one is not. Anyway, let's move on. GMO trees to solve climate change. This will be the final GMO Bar episode, and it's a little bit different to the others. And I'm not going to talk too long because I know I've already been going on for quite a while. But this is different because all the plants I've discussed so far are crop plants that can be grown in traditional controlled environments, whether that's fields, home gardens, orchards, or greenhouses. But what I'm talking about here is actually a forest tree designed to be grown in forests, which can be very controlled environments to some extent, but they're a lot less controlled than even an orchard. And in particular, what we're talking about is GMO poplar trees. Why exactly is it that poplar trees are the only non-edible tree species to have been successfully given the GMO treatment and sent out into the world? Well, to be honest, there's a mixture of reasons. There is no one single compelling reason. And they are not the only one that's been tried or even in development. You might have heard about GMO American chestnut trees. So there's been a decades-long initiative to create GMO American chestnut trees that can survive in the wild. The American chestnut tree was once widespread in the east coast of the US, but it is now extinct in the wild because of a fungal blight disease during the 20th century that still is, if you plant American chestnuts in any wild forest, they will at some point get the blight and die. So these trees do still exist as long as you can kind of control and protect them. And the idea was to use a GMO approach to deliver genes into them that make them more resistant to the fungus. And that has basically where we're at now is it has just gotten approval to grow a kind of trial forest plot of those trees. So they're kind of like right on the precipice where I'd say right now they're still more in the like trial idea phase because it's not clear if it's actually going to be successful enough. And get approval to just plant en masse. So definitely not in the case that right now you could just wander through a forest of GMO American chestnuts. But maybe it will be in the near future. And that contrasts with GMO poplar trees, where if you can kind of get yourself to one, you could go wander around a forest of GMO poplars. Because I don't think they're grown in very like human populated areas. So GMO poplars are part of what is a large scale forestation process in China that's been going on for decades. So China has for decades been investing heavily in reforestation and in some cases creating totally new forest where there wasn't forest, at least in kind of recent decades or centuries, most notably as a means to limit the growth of the Gobi Desert in the face of climate change. It seems quite wild to try and fight a desert by planting a giant wall of trees, but that is indeed the approach that is being taken, and it does seem to be working. I'm not at all an expert on this, I just read a little bit about it, so apologies if I'm misrepresenting that issue. But to my knowledge, poplar is one of the tree species that is widely used in these massive forest planting efforts in China, and it was being held back by the impact of certain tree-eating beetle species. So all the way back in 2002, Chinese researchers at multiple universities and institutes worked on creating Bt poplar. So remember, using that Bt gene that encodes this crystal that will kill certain, there's many different Bt proteins or Bt toxins that target different kinds of insects, mostly beetles and moths, particularly in the larval stage. And so this is, they used a Bt toxin or gene that encodes a Bt toxin that kills particular beetles that were a problem for the poplar trees. It seems to be part of a coordinated state-run initiative. It was hard to me to work out kind of who exactly was directing it, where exactly was the Bt poplar developed. I think it was actually multiple different projects happening in parallel, and there's not just one Bt poplar. And it seems to have been more of a large state-run initiative and definitely not the work of a single large company. Since then, they have been planted at scale. That scale seems to be hundreds of acres. So we're not talking about like everywhere in China is full of GMO poplar trees. They're significant, but they're definitely not even most of the trees being planted in these big reforestation projects. Yeah, and, if you're outside of China, you're not going to find these trees. But in the US, there is a company, Living Carbon, who are making their own GMO poplar trees. In this case, actually not Bt. It's something kind of a little bit wilder and a bit, is it exciting? Is it a stupid gimmick? Time will tell. So back in 2023, there was about 1 million GMO poplar trees planted in the US. Kind of so similar to the GMO chestnuts. What we're talking about here is there's like one trial site that currently exists. It's in Georgia. I don't know exactly where. Those trees would now be juvenile trees, both because poplars grow fairly quickly, but also because what's special about these trees is they've been engineered with a set of genes that in theory should boost their photosynthesis and boost their growth rate accordingly. That is something that has been talked about in kind of plant biotechnology circles for a long time, of targeting the trait of photosynthesis. That's one of the most fundamental traits of a plant. It's kind of core to how plants exist in the world, is that they harvest energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis. And if you could, there's many different like flavors of photosynthesis. Different plants do it in different ways, all using a few core similar mechanisms, but there's ways that some plants are able to be more efficient at doing photosynthesis, basically. And there's single-celled bacteria that do photosynthesis. There's various kinds of algae, brown, red, and green algae, that are able to do photosynthesis. So there's many organisms, not even just plants, that have been able to kind of work out how to do photosynthesis, all in slightly different ways. And so by looking at that natural variation, it can be possible to kind of see how you might be able to take one given plant like poplar and boost its photosynthetic rate by introducing some of the kind of tips and tricks from other organisms. And that, to my knowledge, this is the first time that's actually being kind of tried in what should be a commercial product. And the product part of it here, so this isn't like in China where it seems to be more of a state-run and state-funded initiative of reforestation. The product is carbon credits, basically, or carbon offsetting. The idea is the company, what were they called again? Living Carbon, yeah. They're a private company whose customers are other companies who want to offset their carbon footprint. And the idea is, currently there's lots of ways you can do this, and one of the ways is planting forests. But what if you could plant forests of these GMO trees that, let's say they grow twice as fast? That means you can offset twice the amount of carbon in the same amount of time. That in theory should make the carbon credits half the price. That's the idea, is that they could basically offer cheaper carbon credits to companies to kind of sink the same amount of carbon. So yeah, right now that's just in the kind of trial phase. China is the only place where GMO kind of non-edible trees are being grown at scale. Yeah. Okay. I think it's time to tie up this episode. I know that these are kind of fun and interesting stories, but I want to make clear that if you added the dollar value or the acreage of everything featured in this episode, it would be kind of a drop in the ocean compared to the value and acreage of BT crops and herbicide-tolerant crops, those two types of GMO that are still by far the biggest players. For decades, with, I'd say, a peak in the 2010s, there's been a lot of hype around all the amazing and exciting different kinds of traits that might be possible using recombinant DNA technology. Things like salinity tolerance, drought tolerance, better flavor profiles, and even as bold as what we were just talking about, fundamentally restructuring the way that photosynthesis happens. But very little, other than BT and herbicide tolerance, has had any commercial impact. In Season 2, you'll see a few of the very limited examples, such as the GMO papaya, which I mentioned, which at least has had a big impact within the relatively small papaya industry. But anyway, there is a reason to think that hype and bluster of the 2010s might give way pretty soon to a real shift in what is possible using genetic engineering, really expanding the possibilities there. And that is due to a new tool called CRISPR. And that is what we'll explore in the final episode of Season 1 of Modified. Don't miss it out. Okay, quick recap of what were the organisms that we covered in this episode. And remember, you can go to the show notes if you want to see kind of links to where you can buy some of them or to find out more. So the first one we covered was the glowing plant sold by Light.bio. The second one was the blue roses created and sold by Suntory under the name Applause. The third was the pink glow pineapple created and sold by Del Monte. The fourth was purple tomatoes sold by Norfolk Healthy Produce, and those you buy the seeds. And then there's the rainbow papaya, which you can buy, very easy to get hold of if you're in Hawaii. I'm not sure how easy it is to get hold of otherwise. Arctic apples, which have a look out if you're in the US. I think in Canada, in stores, in the kind of little packets of pre-sliced apples is where you'd find those, and maybe in your kid's school lunch. And then Finally, I talked about BT poplar trees, which are grown en masse in China, and how there are a couple of stands of GMO trees, American chestnut trees and poplar trees in the US to explore both a way to revive the wild populations of American chestnut or to create cheap carbon credits by a company called Living Carbon. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Bye!